Now what we're going to do today, today's a Monday, not a Friday. And Friday it's kind of relabeled the variables day. Today is a Monday, and we're going to look at a new model. And this is a model that, I really should say a tool that Murphy and I developed to look at, I think, some important issues that get overlooked because people don't have a simple analytical framework, so they just move on to the issues where they do have a framework. Now this tool, it's unique in some ways, but it's not too far from what you've already seen. So, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Now the applicable behaviors here, really you could call them all human capital investments. And human capital, of course, is quite important. We worry if we label it in those terms, it might not be easy for everyone to recognize really how ubiquitous behaviors that really are human capital, even though they're not called that. So you'll see when we go through some examples. Now, we did not invent the human capital model at all, but the presentation here is unique, and we developed this presentation, number one, to highlight the increasing returns element of these behaviors. And number two, we like to economize on everything, and we want to use the things you already know. In fact, that itself is a kind of a human capital. You guys know more and more every week about supply and demand, and we want to leverage that knowledge here in this arena. The basic analytics, you could call it a too-good model. There's some commodity of interest, Q, and then all other goods. You could say that. But what's different here is the consumer has a control over the price that they pay for Q. So that kind of brings in a third choice, H, which H is going to be actions that can be taken by the consumer to change their price, in particular to lower their price. If they had to take an action to raise their price, they might not be interested in such an action. Now what's a key feature of this setup is what we call the non-rival feature of the H. What it costs you to lower your price. It's going to cost you some H to say lower your price by 50%. What it costs you to do that is independent of how much of the good you're going to consume. And that's an important feature of human capital. You may have noticed when we, at the university, we sell human capital, right? And we don't charge students differently based on how much they're going to use it. We have a tuition or a teaching requirement, and those people who leave here and never use their diploma had to pay the same as people who use our diplomas, you know, day in and day out for years and years. So that's that non-rival feature is essential, and that's generating the increasing returns. Now we have a utility function over the two goods. That's not new for us. You could talk about the cost function associated with that utility function. We're not going to really look at that. We may come back to that in pieces, but we're going to look at a sub-cost function that you'll see later to break up the problem, like you've done in some problem sets already. Yeah?
I'm a bit lost as to why H is non-rival. Sorry.
So when you buy H, you get a lower P. And that doesn't matter how much Q you're purchasing. So someone who's purchasing 0 Q has to pay the same to lower their price by whatever % as somebody who's buying 100 of Q. And that's, you can see that in the human capital context, right? If I teach you calculus, the time it takes you to learn the calculus has nothing to do with how often you're going to use it. And we may come back to intermediate cases there where maybe the people who use it more have to pay somewhat more. But what's going to be critical here is that they don't have to pay in proportion to how much they use it. Okay. Another thing we're going to do today to keep it simple, the price of H is going to be a constant, and we're going to normalize that to 1. For some interesting applications, you may be interested in comparative statics in that price, and you could add that in, and that would not modify what we're talking about today. So here are several examples. Aside from human capital, which itself, of course, is important. You know, a lot of products have a volume discount, consumer products. The more you buy, the less you pay for each. When I was your age, we had these things called record clubs. You probably never heard of records. You've heard of clubs, maybe. And you joined the club and you could buy records very cheaply. You'd pay a membership fee, and then the records were very cheap. You know, I suppose there are high-tech versions of that. Spotify or something, you buy a membership and then you can have a lot of songs for cheap, maybe even free. And those are examples where you pay some kind of fixed cost membership fee, and that gives you access to a much lower price. We're going to talk about some drugs and alcohol. We'll talk about the vehicles today. I wanted to, at this point, emphasize a couple. Problem set 2, you work through that. That seems like eternity ago now, right? But in problem set 2, I think in the 3rd week, you looked at a case where a person could change the price that they pay for future consumption by paying a fixed cost, getting a better rate of return, which means making future consumption cheaper in terms of how much current consumption you give up. So that's a good example of this. There will be one little difference. Whereas these first several are literally just relabeling the variables without changing anything, the consumer finance one has a little difference to it. Also, the human capital model, human capital and labor supply model, has one small difference to it, and I will point those out.